Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my video review of the Fujinon XF 18 to 120 millimeter LMWR PZ or power zoom lens. More on that and what all that means in just a moment. This lens is a little bit of an oddball in that while on paper it has a lot going for it. It has a great zoom range going from 18 millimeters or 27 millimeter full frame equivalent that looks like this, all the way up to 120 millimeters or 183 millimeter full frame equivalent. It does all of this while maintaining a constant aperture of f4. It has an internally zooming, thoroughly weather-sealed design, and it has unique power zoom capabilities. It is the big brother in every way to the cheap 15 to 45 millimeter power zoom kit lens that comes with some cameras. So why don't more people love it more? Well, find out after a word from our sponsor today.
Today's episode is brought to you by Fantom Wallet, the minimalist modern wallet that is now even better with the new Fantom X that is crafted from aluminum right here in Canada. It is 22% smaller and 35% lighter, while still making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. You could even customize your wallet due to its modular design, with accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even Chipolo and AirTag tracking integration. Visit store.fantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber, and use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out.
So of course Fuji gives us the clues to the various features of the lens right there in the lens title. LM refers to the fact that it has Fuji's premium focus system, linear motors. WR refers to the fact that it has weather resistance, in this case 13 seal points throughout and a fluorine coating on both the rear and the front elements, making those easier to clean. PZ stands for power zoom capabilities. And so all of those things are obviously going to be useful, and more about the power zoom in just a moment. But a lot of people are disappointed by some of the features that are missing. What's not there in that name? First of all, there is no R, which refers to aperture ring. In this case, there is no aperture ring, which makes it pretty odd amongst Fuji zooms, almost all of which do have that aperture ring. And of course, because aperture rings in general are so commonplace on Fuji, most people are accustomed to controlling aperture in that way, and may have their control dial set to some other kind of function, which means when using this particular lens, you're going to have to control aperture through some other means, which is going to be a disappointment for some. Even more disappointing for others, however, will be the fact that there is no OIS in that name. OIS refers to an optical image stabilization. And so there is no in-lens stabilization, which is an odd omission for a lens that is so focused on video production. If you happen to have a camera body, as I've done here testing on the Fuji X-H2, which has excellent in-body image stabilization, no big deal. I was able to hand-hold exposures of a half second at 120 millimeters without any kind of issue, with good repeatability, and could get handheld video without any kind of major issue. But of course, there's a lot of Fuji bodies that don't have in-body image stabilization. And if you've ever tried to capture handheld video with no stabilization, you know how frustrating that shaky footage can be. So it's a really odd omission in a lens that is so video specific. And so in many ways, I think that some of things like the OIS got set aside in order to have the power zoom capabilities. So what is power zoom? Power zoom is, rather than having a ring that actually just moves elements back and forth, it actually routes things through a motor that powers the zoom function itself. So why would you want that? Well, as we're going to see here, there are different ways to control a power zoom, both within the lens, and then also you can externally control it through various means. It actually pairs really nicely with this recent grip from them, the TGBT1 tripod grip, that will allow you to not only do things like start record or take photos, things like that, but it'll also allow you to control that power zoom. As you can see in this shot here, I did that remotely by using Bluetooth on this particular grip. So being able to remotely control power zoom or zoom function is going to be useful in some certain situations. Kind of a camcorder style type control over that, which is not all that typical on, mirrorless type bodies. Now, there are three different ways within the lens itself to control that zoom. So the first is obviously the zoom ring itself. But as I mentioned, any kind of function here actually rotates through an actual motor that powers that. So as a byproduct, it's a little bit of a different feel. It's kind of more like focus feel than it is zoom feel. So you might be a little bit thrown by that if you're not accustomed to it. The other thing that is an issue if you're just a photographer, which I'm primarily do photography with video as an aside, there's no quick way to get from point A to point B as far as zooming through the range. So starting here at 18 millimeters, by my count, it takes a total of 5 at least rotations to get all the way through from 18 to 120 millimeters. So as you can see, neither is that particularly fast, and it feels like a lot of wasted motion to accomplish that. So in many ways, doing the actual focus or zoom ring here is probably going to be disappointing in some applications. Now there is a second way here to control that, and it's through a rocker style switch here that is pressure sensitive. And so if you go hard, it will zoom faster. If you put less pressure on it, it will zoom slower. And so I can move from as gradually as just a little bit, and then I can speed it up and go quite a bit faster. And in that situation, it took me about 3 seconds to go from 18 to 120 millimeters. The final way to control that is via 2 switches that are underneath this ZF switch. And the way that they function is that once you hit one, it will begin what is more like a zoom pull, a pan in or a pan out, where it moves very slowly. And when I say very slowly, in this clip, you can see how slowly it's moving. I probably can't show you the whole clip, but it took 29 seconds to go from one extreme of the focal length to the other. So this obviously is only going to be useful in some certain situations. If you happen to want a very slow panning out or panning in, or if you're wanting to do a smaller, more gradual type movement, it's fine for that. And it starts going once you click that, and it will go all the way through to the end unless you click it again, at which point it will stop at that point. And so if I just start it going, I got to click it again to stop it. But it almost takes a second. It's a little bit fidgety in terms of getting that, so it'll probably take some practice to get down how it actually functions. Now there is another option here, and that is that ZF button. That is allowing you to switch between zoom or focus. And so with this, and it's controlling this rocker style ring here. And so what you can do is you can switch between a zoom function, kind of a zooming or panning in and out, to a focus type pull. And in this case, you have the ability to do that focus pull. And again, it is going to be pressure sensitive. But the problem is that even at its extreme, it does not move all that quickly. And so even if you go as fast as you can, it's hard to do a long focus pull like that because it just takes a number of seconds to get from one extreme to the other. And so you're going to spend a lot of time with your shot completely out of focus before you start to actually see a pull of focus. So it's more useful over smaller focus pulls than going from one extreme like macro to infinity type shot. But another way where that's a little bit compromised is by the simple fact that you have to have pressure on that to start it, which means that when you get to your desired place where you want focus to end, you have to find a way of letting off pressure without jarring the camera. And it's not all that easy to do. And so it's going to be compromised there. So unfortunately for photographers, zoom is pretty much compromised through the Powerzoom. You're probably not going to enjoy the mechanics of zooming unless you're a very small percentage person out there. For the most part, I did not enjoy this zoom functionality. But videographers are going to be put off by another factor, and that is the fact that this lens is not parfocal. And so even if you are zooming in, unfortunately, the focus motor is having to make little adjustments along the way because it's not staying in focus, which it would if it were a parfocal design. And what I find is that you can see those little focus adjustments along the way. Or if I do the fast zooming in, as you can see here, focus is not really keeping up. So I get all the way to my Milwaukee charger, and then focus is catching up, a split second later. So it makes for slightly jarring shots. And all of that could be avoided if they had gone with a parfocal design here. And so I think that is another area that has really disappointed those that are kind of video specific. So unfortunately, A lot of the controls here on the body are all about this zoom or, focus pull type situation, but neither works quite as well as what I would like. And as a byproduct, there's other things that you could have as physical controls that you just don't have. Now, what is appealing is the overall physical design here. As noted, this is an internally zooming lens, which means that it's a great lens to put on a gimbal because whatever focal length you're shooting at, the balance is going to be the exact same. That's awesome. And the lens itself is moderately sized. It does mean that because it is internally zooming, it is a little bit larger for storage than what some opposing lenses are, but it's always going to stay the same length at the same time, which also probably helps with the weather sealing as well. So the lens itself is 3 inches in diameter, or right over 77 millimeters. It is 4.9 inches in length, or 123.5 millimeters, and it weighs in at 1 pound or 470 grams. Moderately sized. There's a 72 millimeter front filter thread on front. And the overall build quality is what you would expect from Fuji's nicer lenses. It feels like a well-built lens and obviously well weather sealed. So a lot of pluses on that front, but there probably are a few control type things and a few ergonomic misses that are going to upset the apple cart a little bit. Now, as noted earlier, this does have a linear focus motor, and focus is fast and quiet. I found accuracy to be good, and focus was fast enough that I could pick up birds in flight, and I could track them quite successfully, as you can see in this sequence here. I also saw good eye tracking capabilities, whether I was tracking an animal, insect, or a human subject, so no negatives there. In fact, for stills, I don't really have any complaint about autofocus at all. It was snappy, it was accurate, it did what I wanted it to do. When it comes to the video side, things are mostly good with a few minor exceptions. My focus pulls were smooth, as you can see here, but what I did find is that there is a little bit of split hesitation when it arrives almost to the subject, a little bit of a pause, and then it finishes and settles in on focus. Again, it pulls you out of the shot a little bit. I did find better results if I was doing my hand test, and it seems that in general the focus is more confident if it has an AI trackable type subject and it can, knows what it's going to focus on, and it does a little bit better job with that. Focus breathing was low, so that's a positive there. I also found that, for example, I had my daughter do a shot where I was approaching in my Ford Maverick for my Maverick review, and you can see that as the Maverick approaches and then pans past the camera, you can see that focus stayed accurately locked on there and moved along without any kind of visible stepping. So that part was good, but as we already saw earlier in the clip with the fast zooming, that focus can't quite keep up with fast zooming capabilities. Again, a problem that could have been solved by it being parfocal. In general, autofocus was good with those few minor exceptions there. So how about the image quality? Obviously, anytime you engineer for a lens with a 6.7 times zoom ratio and a constant maximum aperture, there are going to be some challenges along the way. For the most part, I think that Fuji has managed those quite well and that there are no major flaws here. But as we're going to see, there aren't really any major strengths either optically. Let's take a closer look.
So let's start by revisiting that focal range once again. So as you can see here at closer distance, this is 18 millimeters and then at 120 millimeters. So obviously at close focus distances, that is or closer I should say, that is a huge amount of variability choices for your framing. For landscape type purposes, you have a huge amount of variability on how you can approach a certain scene, which obviously is going to be very useful either for stills here, as we're showing, but also for video, obviously. So at the 18 millimeter end, you can see that we do have some pronounced barrel distortion here, though as you can see, it's also not super severe. There is some vignette, which we'll address here in just a moment. You can see from my manual correction that fortunately the nature of this barrel distortion, which isn't always the case, is that it is quite linear, and so it actually corrects very well even manually, though it's obviously going to correct even better with a correction profile. So you can see that I dialed in a plus 17, so that is a significant amount of barrel distortion, but as you can see, as I already mentioned, it cleaned up well. And then as far as the vignette, plus 73, about 3 stops there in the corner, so a significant amount of vignette on the wide end, though again, it cleans up just fine. Now, very early on, that distortion quickly flips to a pincushion style distortion. So already here at 35 millimeters, you can see some fairly pronounced pincushion distortion. As we move on through the zoom range, that continues to be the case fairly constantly, all the way through to 120 millimeters. But fortunately, the nature of most pincushion distortion, and it is the case here, is that again, it's very linear, and so even with a manual correction, you can see that the line straightened up perfectly, which tells you that the profile is going to do a great job. There's also less vignette here than before. My settings for correction was a -14, so again, a significant amount, but again, it corrects fine, and then a +39 when it comes to the vignette. So the vignette is much less heavy on the telephoto end. We'll take a look at chromatic aberrations, starting with longitudinal chromatic aberrations. In this case, longitudinal chromatic aberrations, not too bad. It's not a huge maximum aperture, so as you can see here at closer focus distances, there is a little bit of fringing before and after the plane of focus. Nothing pronounced, however. Out in the real world, I didn't really see anything that concerned me too much. Even here at a 200% magnification, you can see that there is a little bit of fringing around some of these edges, but nothing here that's going to show up and cause any kind of problem. Where things do get worse, however, is when you have a little bit higher contrast, so slightly harsher lighting in a scene. So here you can see that on the longer end here, that we do start to see some fringing here in these high contrast areas. This is a lens that in some situations does struggle with its contrast, and so you can see some fringing there. This is more of a lateral style chromatic aberration near the edge of the frame, but it does show up in certain situations. Now we can see here on the 18mm end, as far as lateral chromatic aberrations, there's not a whole lot there to see except for just a little bit really concentrated towards the very edge of the frame. However, if we jump up to 120mm, you can see that it starts to ramp up in terms of those lateral chromatic aberrations, much more pronounced here. And so obviously you're going to need to click to correct for that, but there's enough there that in certain lighting situations, it may not even all correct just with that one click correction in Lightroom or other types of software. So let's take a look at resolution and contrast. The MTF chart showed a good center performance, a little bit of a dip to the center of the frame. However, as you get out to the outer third, there's a dip, and then it comes back up towards the edge of the frame. We'll see if that is the case here. So looking in the center of the frame, here's my caveat. This is an XH2, so 40 megapixels. This is a 200% magnification. This is an extreme torture test. And you can see that in the center of the frame, I would say that it passes no problem. That's not a bad looking result at all. Decent contrast, good detail, though, it doesn't jump off the charts in terms of detail, but quite good. Mid-frame also looking quite good. I have no complaints there. And even though there's a dip that should happen along this portion, it doesn't look too bad. And as we look down here towards the corner, also looking pretty decent at 18mm. Now, if we stop down in the center of the frame, f5.6, we see a very mild contrast improvement, nothing significant there. In the mid-frame, also a little bit more contrast, nothing again jumping off the charts, but certainly an improvement. And then the corners, we can definitely see some improvement there. We'll pop over this side and take a look at centering. You can see that it is just a little bit better at f5.6 down here. You can see that it's maybe not quite as strong on the left side of the frame, and you can see that this corner looks a little bit softer than what this corner does. Now from f5.6 to f8, there's less of a jump, and part of that is because already we are past the diffraction limit on a high-resolution body like the XH2, and what that means is that from this point onward, diffraction is going to start to soften the image. And so you can see we kind of hit a high water mark there at f5.6, and at f8, it's really not improved anywhere that we look across the frame, and that is because of the effects of diffraction already. And if we carry that to its logical conclusion, if at f8 we're starting to see a little bit of diffraction, by f22 it should be very pronounced, and we see, of course, that is the case. You can see that contrast and, kind of the overall acuity or ability to render fine details has really been impacted. So avoid anything past f11 if you can. After that point, I just don't think that you'll be happy with the trade-offs you get on a higher resolution body. So moving on throughout the zoom range, if we go to 35mm-ish, as you can see here, looking in the center of the frame comparing to 18mm, you can see that there is a little bit of improvement in contrast here in the center of the frame.
Mid-frame, less obvious, about the same, and if we look down into the corners, we can see that there is just a little bit more contrast, so a little bit more of a consistent performance across the frame. And if we look at an area like this, which is in that place where there is a little bit of a dip at 18 millimeters, there's less of it at 35 millimeters, so a little bit more of a consistent performance there in that middle zone that carries on here towards the edge. And as you can see on this, the left side of the frame, it's a more obvious improvement at 35 millimeters, and definitely up here in the corner, a pretty radical improvement. Now, if we compare 35 millimeters with 50 millimeters, what do we find? In the center of the frame, 50 millimeters is better still. Just a little bit more contrast, as you can see there, so a little bit more of a detail pop. In the mid-frame, it also has more resolution and contrast, and as we pop down towards the corner, we can definitely see that there is more contrast here as well. So a stronger performance, and also it continues to have that better left side performance than what we saw at 18 millimeters. Moving on, comparing 50 millimeters with 90 millimeters, at this point we have passed kind of our peak performance. And so if this represents the high watermark at 50 millimeters, somewhere between there and as we get towards the telephoto end, we can see that things are starting to drop off. And so not nearly as sharp there, not nearly as sharp in the mid frame, not nearly as sharp down in the corner as well. Now, what we do find is there is a more significant improvement if you stop the lens down here at 90 millimeters. And so there's obviously a pretty radical improvement from f4 to f5.6. So if you're shooting towards the end and you want more, just going that one stop to f5.6 is going to make a pretty obvious improvement in terms of the overall performance and get us kind of back into the realm that we've been accustomed to for its performance. Now, unfortunately, the trend that we saw at 90 millimeters does continue at 120 millimeters, but it's a little bit worse for a reason I'm going to point out in just a moment. So first of all, there is a little bit more contrast than what I saw at 90 millimeters wide open. You can see, however, that the mid frame, everything is still a little bit soft looking, and towards the edges of the frame, it's actually a little bit worse than what we saw at 90 millimeters. 90 millimeters, there's still some pretty good detail here. Details are a little bit more mushy on that side. And if we pop over to the left side of the frame, we can see that they are roughly about the same. No major improvement for either side. The main difference here is there isn't that same kind of good improvement just stopping down at f5.6. So at 120 millimeters, I can stop down, and while there is a little bit more contrast here, you can see that we really haven't sharpened up strongly here. And if we look down here, you can see that everything remains just a little bit soft, and down into this corner, you can see that it just doesn't sharpen up in the same way that we saw there at 90 millimeters. So as far as real-world performance at 100% magnification, you can see that even if you look at the fur along there, it's just not super sharp. Here, stop down to f8, which should be about optimal here. You can see at a pixel level that contrast and detail is still it's okay, but it's not exceptionally good. What I did find is that you can get better results in lower contrast situations. At 120 millimeters, it doesn't really handle really high contrast situations super well. But here you can see at 100% magnification, that really looks fairly good there. This is wide open, 120 millimeters f4, and obviously the bokeh quality is really nice. So obviously that is going to be somewhat of an impact when it comes to the up-close performance, but as you can see here, it is a 0.20 times magnification, so it's not off the charts, but it's very useful. And as you can see here, it actually is producing a pretty good result. Nice flat plane of focus. It's a very useful magnification. So we saw how in this shot that contributed to a nice blurred out background. And I will say at 120 millimeters, it may not be incredibly sharp, but the bokeh quality is quite nice. And even in this shot, which is a little bit more complex in terms of the distance to some of the other subjects, you can see that detail looks pretty good there. And really there isn't anything that's jarring in the image. And in this another situation where you're kind of at optimal conditions with the background blurred out, there's enough contrast and detail there to make the image useful even on a high resolution body, and then nicely blurred out background. Now I did find at some of the shorter focal lengths I got a little bit less pleasing bokeh. You can see here there's some more obvious outlining, and a little bit further back that outlining is there. It's a little bit busier, and if we take a look at the foreground stuff here, it's it's busier still, just a little bit more edging than what I would like, but again not bad for a zoom lens. Now you may have noticed the nice colors on the previous image, and obviously that is a strength for Fuji glass quite often. And in this case, you know, this is again shooting at 18 millimeters. No, I'm not wowed by the detail, but if I step back and look at the image in the way that most people are going to look at it, it's very nice. Greens had a nice saturation, not oversaturated, but well captured. Here's another image that I thought was really nice. Colors being, you know, lovely with a nice amount of saturation, but without becoming garish or overdone. And again, detail, while it's not off the chart, is certainly good enough to look good at an image and certainly would be plenty for printing. Here's another image that just captured light and color very, very nicely. Early morning light and a very kind of hazy day. And I really enjoyed the image that I got. Then finally, a couple of images just shot right into the sun, and you can see with it in different positions. I found that flare resistance was really quite good, and so that wasn't an issue either. And so as you can see from our optical breakdown, there's really nothing that kind of stands out and jars you as being optically wrong with this lens, but neither is there anything that jumps out and says, wow, about either the images or the sharpness, any of those things along the way. You know, chromatic aberrations, for example, are well controlled in some situations, but in more harsh lighting, not so well. And so there are things that it does well and things that it does only okay. And so at the end of the day, that brings us to the price point of about $900 US, making it expensive enough that you have to really, really want what the lens offers to lay down that kind of money. Now, if you are just purely a photographer who occasionally does video, you're probably going to be more interested in the lens like the 16 to 80 millimeter f4. It has more traditional controls on it. It has an optical stabilizer. It's $100 less. You have to really, really want the power zoom capabilities of this lens. And if you're looking for an upgrade over the 15 to 45 millimeter PZ, that's kind of best case scenario here. And that this lens does everything that that lens does, just a little bit better, and with a much more useful zoom range as a part of it. On paper, there's a lot of good promise to this lens, and I really like the idea of it. When I first started shooting with it, I thought, this is great. But the more that I actually used it and then tried to use it for its intended purposes, I was let down by the execution in some key areas. And so I think that Fuji had some great ideas here, but didn't necessarily execute them quite as well as what they should have. And so I would recommend this lens really only if you are looking for a power zoom type lens and the capabilities that a lens like this offers. Otherwise, I think Fuji has some better options. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review, to my image gallery. There are buying links there, linkage to follow me on social media, to get channel merchandise, or to become a patron. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.